So in real time, I'm actually a couple weeks ahead of my YouTube uploading schedule, which is kind of nice to not be trying to finish stuff super quick to get on the internet, which means I have a little bit of an intro for this video. So recently someone sent me this photo. It's actually one of my neighbors, and asked me if I could recreate a chair similar to this. He wanted the basic design. We made some slight modifications, but in general this is the chair I'm making. So since all of these parts, you have, let's see, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 different bent pieces in this chair, I decided to, before I show the build of this chair, upload a comprehensive video designed for beginners if you want to kind of get your feet wet in steam bending. So I am not an expert steam bender. I've done some wood bending before in the past, and I feel competent enough in my skills to be able to post an informational video on the internet, but there's going to probably be people that have been doing it longer that could give you somewhat more conclusive advice. Not necessarily different, just more tricks of the trade. But this video is geared towards people, like I said, who kind of want to get their feet wet and don't know much about steam bending, just because there's a lot of conflicting views on the internet about steam bending. And in my research for this project, I literally probably watched 30 different videos, went to multiple different websites, and I thought it would be nice to kind of take all of the information that I used when practicing these bends as well as online and put it into one video. So that is what this is going to be. So the first thing you're going to have to do is build something to hold all the steam as well as your lumber. So I used to have a wooden steam box, but I found it was really hard to regulate the temperature. So after doing a little bit of research, I decided to go with metal piping this time. And this is a 6-inch diameter galvanized steel pipe. You can get this at any hardware store. They're really cheap. This was like $10. They come split. You can see you kind of have to squeeze it together. And the nice thing about this is only going to be 5 feet, but if I wanted to go bigger, I could always add an extension onto it. So it's easier to make this, have a nice smaller one, but make it bigger as well. I just put a piece of aluminum tape on that seam, and then I could start finishing it up. So for my door, I'm using a 6-inch cap that goes on. It's made for putting on the end of these pieces. It's crimped, so it will fit nicely onto the end. So I'm just going to attach a wooden handle onto this. This is a wooden handle I had laying around. So I'm just drilling some holes, and then I could attach that handle. So the interesting thing about steam is that steam itself is actually invisible. So whenever you see someone, a lot of times nuclear power plants, when you say, oh, that's steam, it's actually water vapor that you can visibly see. The steam itself is invisible because steam is just vaporized water. So it's water in the gas phase, and then once it starts to condense, it becomes water vapor, and that's what you can visibly see. So you can see that cap just squeezes nicely onto the end of that piece. The crimp in the actual pipe makes it so you kind of have to squeeze it a little bit to get it on, which is convenient in the sense that it makes a nice tight fit. So for the other end of the pipe, I'm using a dampener with a key lock on it, which was the cap and this were about $6. So for about $20 I got all of my metal parts. So this dampener is nice because I could have it closed, but I could also open it. You don't want this container, no matter what you're making it out of, to be completely sealed, because you don't want to even think about pressurizing this steam. So you can see that key fits in place, and I could open and close it. And since it's winter time, I ended up just shoving some insulation in the back end of that and keeping it closed. So that is just how that mechanism works. Now, when I thought about remaking this, I've seen people make these out of PVC, and I was actually thinking of that because I have some left over from my dust collection build. But I've heard people say that the PVC can melt. If it gets too hot, it starts to distort, and I just really hate plastic. So that is why I went with metal. And I could tell you, because I've been steam bending, that the metal holds the temperature really well. I really like the way it turned out. So you need something inside the container that will elevate the material off the base floor, because you want that steam to be able to move 360 degrees around the wood. So I'm just making almost a ladder of sorts that will fit into the steam box, but it could also be pulled out so you could easily add thicker, more cumbersome pieces into the inside of the box. I'm going to be gluing these dowels into place. This is just scrap poplar and 5/8 inch dowels. I kind of used what I had on hand, and this is about 5 inches wide, so it sits a little up off the bottom of the piece. I use glue just for alignment. Once you put this in the box and you start generating steam, the glue joints will kind of deteriorate as it goes. Now, the way that this steam bending works is there's lignin in the wood, and the lignin in the wood is an organic polymer, whereas something like polyethylene is going to be a synthetic polymer. So this organic polymer, if you introduce heat to it, so extreme heat, which would be steam, that lignin becomes more plastic and more malleable, and depending on, you can't exceed its limits, but that is how you can bend it, by making that lignin more plastic. So the ideal temperature to do this is about 212 degrees, which is why I'm adding a thermometer in there. And that thermometer, I just kind of put it in the side. It's an old thermometer from a barbecue. And then this is actually a wallpaper remover. These are commonly used to generate the steam. I just found a palm pump fixture that fits on the end of it. I just drilled a hole in the container. I had this from my first steam bending build. It's a little bit smaller. Some people just use a pot of boiling water, which works as well. And this is kind of the setup I have, elevated off the ground in my shop. And it also is tilted to one side so water can roll out the back side of it. So now that I have my container for holding the steam, the next thing is going to be to build jigs. So the first part I was bending for this were going to be the legs, and this was going to be one of the hardest bends because the legs themselves are 2 inches thick in all diameters. So my jig had to be 2 inches tall. You always want to have some sort of structure against whatever you're bending, because there's extreme forces of compression and tension going on at the same time. So if the wood has any escape from those two forces, it's going to split and crack. So making these jigs and making the bending straps, or however you decide to bend this, making them strong is super important. So you can see I just laminated a bunch of sheet of plywood, and I don't have a very good bandsaw, so whenever I have a curve like this, I usually pre-cut all of my pieces so that I can it's easier to finish it once it's all done. And I let this set up overnight. Then I just cleaned it up so that one edge, even though the flatness of these two edges isn't really crucial, I cleaned it up. And then I had to clean up that curve, all the run out from the glue, but part of the back end was going to be straight as well, so you could see I kind of cut that just to make life easier as well. And then with the hand plane, I could then recreate that nice curve that I wanted. And then I could clean it up with a belt sander and get a nice square face for that wood to lay against. Now all of the forms I'm making are based on the chair, and I'll be posting videos of the chair build if you want to see why I decided to make them the length and sizes I wanted to. They're not in this video just because this video would then become extremely long. So then in order to have attachments for clamps, because I'm going to be clamping the bending strap as well as the lumber as I bend it, I drilled, I believe these were 1.5 count holes. They're not all the way through, they're about 3/4 of the way through, and then I could just remove the plugs. And this is going to be based on the clamps you're using as the diameter of that hole. So you'll see when it comes time to bend this that I could then put the head of the clamp in that hole and bend it that way. So now this was my first attempt, and I made a very quick, cheaply made bending strap using the wrong material all around. I'm also using a winch, which I will continue using because bending this is extremely hard, and it's really a two-person job, and there's only one of me. So the winch kind of almost makes it like there's another human there. You could see all of the failures happening as I was going. So I knew I needed a heavy duty bending strap, and I didn't want to make one originally because you kind of have to make it out of nice hardwood, and I hate using my nicer hardwoods for jigs. But you could see after that failure, I just decided to count my losses and do it. I'm going to put a link in the description to a person who makes a bending strap, and this is kind of based off of it roughly, if you want a little more information or another video on how these are made. But basically I have these really big eye hooks, and I'm going to be sinking them. I made mortises with my dado jig in there, and you could see how half of it will fit in there. So they're both half and half, and then I mortised out a spot for the nut so that this sits flush. And then that eye hook I could attach my winch to. So then the length of mine is based off of the leg I'm making. So I bought this really nice piece of metal from McMaster Car. This is, I believe they called it, the slang for it is blue steel, but it was the definition of it was spring tension steel or something like that. So that is what I use because there's a lot of tension. It was really hard to drill through because I don't do a ton of metal work, so I just didn't have the right drill bits. So I didn't film drilling the holes, but you could see I put 2 holes in the end of it, and I'm marking it on the bottoms, which are the cherry. So then once I had those, I can drill the holes through the cherry because I'm going to put carriage bolts through all 3 pieces, the top and bottom part of the lumber as well as the metal part. Now ideally the metal would stretch the whole length of my bending strap, but it only came in certain increments, and it's kind of expensive, so I just went for the shorter one. So you could see this was like, I almost freaked out at this point because it wasn't fitting, but I just had it on backwards because I was pretty frustrated with building these things at this point. So once I had those carriage bolts in place, I could sink them in so the square part of the carriage bolt engages with that lumber and cannot spin, and then I could add nuts to it, and then I'm going to be drilling 2 more holes on each piece with more carriage bolts. So all of this is firmly attached. Now you can see that the cherry is longer than the walnut, and that is because when you go to bend this, the wood's going to be sitting against the walnut, and if the back portion isn't longer, as you saw in my last bend, the metal will bend and tear, so that wood will keep the metal strap in place. So then I'm just countersinking some holes and drilling some more holes through this lumber in order to sink 2 more carriage bolts in there. I'm also putting a piece of this aluminum tape on the edge because that wood that comes out of the bender is going to be wet, and the end grain, I don't want it to absorb a ton of it. So this is just testing that piece before I put it in my strap. Now you can see on my strap the jig is glued to the table, the winch is attached to one eye hook, and then I have a huge lag screw attached in my table holding the other end in place. Now you're constantly going to be having to hammer this into place because it's going to want to lift on you. So the first thing I do once that's in place is attach it with clamps. So I clamp the whole bending jig as well as the wood to the first hole in my jig, and then I clamp the other end of the wood as well. Now this is catching on my lay stand, but once it's done catching, it bends really easily. When you're bending this stuff, when it's not going well, you could feel it in the bend. When it's bending really well, you could feel just how smoothly it moves. So I have to move quickly because this stuff will start the lignin will start setting very quickly, especially in the cold weather. So you can see as I move, I'm just attaching clamps. I'll keep those clamps in place and just make sure that everything is firm. So now this wood will bend back a little bit. It will sometimes they say about 10%, so you should account for over bending all of your materials to account for that spring back. But you could see on the second attempt all of the changes I made worked really well. There's no tear out, no cracks or anything in that lumber. Everything's sitting nice and flush. So then you could see just how much that wood sprung back, and I have a rough piece of 2x10 sitting on top of my jig. It's the same shape as the legs I need, and this is kind of my rudimentary drying form. So I'm just going to clamp that leg onto that. It was in the jig for about an hour. Then I'm transferring it to this 2x6, clamping it in place so that it can't move. And then I'll let that sit on there overnight. That's just so that you could keep bending parts. They don't have to keep jamming up your jig, because I'm not going to make 4 of these jigs. Now, as you can see, the metal will stain the wood. That wasn't a huge problem for me because I had to sand these anyway. So then this is the second attempt, same process. I actually put some wax paper on the metal to kind of cut down on the stain, but it didn't really make an effect. You could see bending it. Now the thing you're looking for with this lumber is you want to get air dried lumber. If you get kiln dried lumber, I know there are people online who say they've bent kiln dried lumber. Lumber is kiln dried in 2 ways, either through heat or through dehumidification. So the dehumidification takes a lot longer, and I believe that is the kiln dry lumber that you can somewhat bend. But if you kiln dry it with heat, it usually sets the lignin and it can't be plasticized again. So you're just kind of, if you can do it, that's great, but I feel like it's just going to be a huge headache. So this is air dried lumber that I got from the guy up the street, and it's white oak. White oak supposedly bends the best. So that is what I got. So then in order for these to set up, I kept these out for a week, and I put them in those pipe clamps so that they're all held in place. You see I have 4 of them, and I let those set up for about a week before I did anything with them. I know you could throw them in the oven if you want to use them faster, but I just kept them in clamps. So now I'm making another jig because I have to bend the back part of the chair, and this jig's a little different, so I filmed this one as well. Same process, just laminating a bunch of pieces together. You could see that this form is based off the back of the chair, and I made the curve a little steeper to allow for that spring back. Now, if you're making a chair, a lot of times people will use green lumber, almost to the point where the tree is freshly cut. It was a little harder to find information about how long the wood has to set if it's green based on the humidity still in the wood, whereas the air dried lumber, they recommended about 20%, which I believe is about the humidification I got from the lumber from the guy I got. So you can use green lumber, but the air dried and green lumber in general are just harder to find. Most things are kiln dried these days. So then I'm attaching 2x6s so that this jig is elevated off the table and it has the curve that I want. Now this one I admittedly built very quickly, and that is because you could see the amount of time it takes to build these jigs. This is the first chair I've ever made, and there's a really good chance I won't make another chair for 5 years. So I didn't want to spend a ton of time making these jigs. So the bending strap is something that I could use down the line. This jig for the chair back is something I will not use unless I make another one of these chairs. So I only needed 2 good bends out of this, so I made it to last for 2 bends, and that's pretty much all it lasted for. So that metal, like I said, is kind of expensive, and I didn't want to buy a super thick piece because the back's going to be about 5 inches wide. So I had this scrap piece of, it's almost like aluminum flashing laying around. I bent it in half and then folded over the edge of it, and this is what I was going to use as my bending strap for this piece. So as I continue bending this over, like I was saying earlier, I use air dried quarter sawn oak for this. I've heard quarter sawn is better than flat sawn. It's going to be expensive though, and like I said, the lumber's harder to find. Now I have heard people say stuff like they soak this stuff in fabric softener and all this sort of stuff. I don't like to mess with stuff like that, because then it's an issue of, does the fabric softener affect the lumber in the long term? Does the fabric softener affect any finish you put on it? So I just stuck with air dried quarter sawn oak for this. So this is my finished strap. You could see I made it in the same way, but I'm using pressure treated 3/4 inch lumber, and then I have like a lever clamp to the edge. So I'm kind of breaking my rules with this second jig, and but like I said, I only needed to get 2 out of it, so I could put that piece in there. That piece is about 5 inches wide by about 3/4 inch thick. So it sits right on the back there, and then I could bend this down. Now, since this is thinner, you could bend this mostly by hand. It would still have been awesome to have someone helping, because you could see I'm kind of sitting on the lever and trying to clamp it in place. But I have a huge C-clamp, and once I got it in place, I could just really ratchet this down. Now these I let set up overnight as well, because I was only bending one at a time. So I added a bunch of clamps to it. Now it kind of rose off both ends of my jig a little bit, but that was okay because it rose off in the same amount on both sides. So you can see the next day I could take it out. There's a little bit of spring back, and then I let these dry the exact same way. I put them in my panel clamps and then let this set up for a week before I did anything else with it. And then these are the 2 pieces. They bent exactly the same, and those will be, they look a little off because that one panel clamp is bigger than the other. So then the last bend I'm going to show you, because this jig is a little bit different. This is like a sandwich jig. I don't know if there's a technical term for it. So I once again laminated a sheet of lumber and let it set up overnight with some weight on top of it, and now I'm just trimming off the edges to make it nice and clean. Now this is the piece that I need to bend. I already made a pattern for it. I'm transferring that pattern onto my jig, just extending those lines, and then I'll cut this out with a jigsaw. Before I cut it out, I'm putting 2 marks. These are just alignment marks, so I know where the piece was. So part of the battle with the steam bending is figuring out what sort of jig will work. If you do a Google search or even on YouTube, there are so many different varieties of these jigs. I decided to use the sandwich jig because towards the end, I'm probably gonna bend this last complex curve in 2 pieces at the same time, and glue them together, almost like a laminated bend. And that is because I was running out of lumber for this build. So right now I'm putting these strips across my center mark, and these are going to be alignment strips. I have a piece of pine in there kind of showing how far the jig has to open in order to fit the oak in. Now for this one I'm building a drying form, and that is because I have to bend a bunch of these, and since they're smaller I could bend a bunch of them at once, because the rule of thumb for lumber is going to be they have to steam for an hour for every inch of thickness. So for the 2-inch pieces, they were in there for almost 2 hours. I actually ended up keeping them in there longer. So for these thinner ones that are about, these ended up being 3/8 of an inch, it was only like half an hour, 45 minutes. So I could build a bunch of them within the day. So this drying rack is basically just based off of the same dimensions. You could see I cut it out, and I'm using that tape measure to figure out how long I needed it to be. For the metal piece, I just kind of taped a bunch of aluminum shims together, so there was 4 for each, just because once again I didn't want to buy more metal. You could see how I finished up that jig with the 2 pieces in place. So then I could slide these 2 strips of wood in and use panel clamps in order to finish this bend up. So the reason I was running out of wood is because the wood not only has to be air dried white oak and potentially quarter sawn, you also can't have a ton of grain out in your lumber. So if the grain run out in your lumber, which means the grain runs off the edge of the piece you're bending, in less than 12 inches, it's most likely going to split. So you have to use very specific lumber for this. So even though I bought a ton of it, I was running out, which is why I decided to build this, bend this last piece laminated like this. You can also see those strips of poplar I used for alignment are being torqued, and that is just because there's just so much pressure going on with these pieces, and it is lifting off the table a little bit. Only one side is screwed down to my table, but that ended up not really mattering. You can see with that bend, I only had one little crack towards the top, and it ended up not being substantial. So I let this set up in the jig for about an hour, and then I transferred it to my drying rack. And then same thing, since these have to be glued together, I probably won't glue them together for another week or so. And then now that I know that this works, I could now make a bunch of these because I'll need 4 of these. So this is the portion of the video where I add all the things I forgot to mention. There's just a lot to steam bending, and even seasoned pros will tell you you'll get misbends every once in a while. It's just the nature of the lumber. So there's just a lot of information I'm trying to cover in this video. So that is my piece in the drying rack. One thing is I ended up covering my tube with insulation because as it got colder, it was harder to hold in the heat. Eventually I'll make a box that the tube can go into and put insulation in there, but I always end up finding scrap. I didn't want to buy lumber. So this is the white oak slab I used to make the legs. I had to buy this whole slab in order to get pieces where the grain run out was going to work for this. This is probably, I think, one of the most frustrating parts of steam bending is finding the right lumber. So you can see I'm specifically using a hatchet in order to get the break along the grain where I want it. People that make chairs usually will slice up all the pieces with hatchets, so where the grain naturally breaks is where you'll get the best lumber. So you can see this is quarter sawn, so I have vertical lines going across there, and then I could slab this out and use it as pieces. Now I couldn't find conclusive evidence about how you situate the grain as you bend it, how it affects the bend, so I didn't really pay attention to that, and I don't think it had an effect on my finish progress. So you can see this is what I'm talking about. The grain on this piece doesn't run out on my ruler. It's kind of pretty much staying parallel. If it runs out a lot, that is where you get splits like this. This is also the piece from my first bending strap. You could see my bending strap wasn't wide enough, and that is why it split. And then so this, the one last thing to mention about these bending straps are the way that this wood is working, and once you measure it, the inside dimension will not change, but the outside of it, since it's under tension, it's actually being stretched. So that is why you have to have all of these the bending strap and the metal keeping everything compressed, because it's going to want to rip and bend as that outer portion is being stretched under tension, whereas the inner portion is being reduced because of compression. So you have those two opposing forces happening at once. So that's another reason why you can't have knots or anything in the wood, because the wood will crack on those knots. And so I'm closing this out again with my first successful bend of the leg after that misbend. And so like I said, I tried to make this as comprehensive as possible. I know there's stuff I probably left out, but like I keep saying, it is a very involved process, and you should be able to get some successful bends from watching this video. I'm also going to put a couple really good resources of other videos, as well as a website with an instruction booklet, so that if you like stuff written out and something that you can read as well to look at, but also it's going to be a matter of just trying out different things and figuring out what works. People that do steam bending professionally, they have really nice jigs because they're doing them over and over and over again. For me, I wanted to make jigs that could get me through the piece because I probably will not be using them again. But steam bending is just, it's really just a very cool process, and every time I watch it, I'm amazed that this wood can actually bend. If you're interested in seeing what all of these pieces become, my next set of videos is going to be the chair build, which uses all of this oak.